Hello.
Good morning. Good morning, Tracy. Tracy, you're looking very festive this morning.
You got to do it. You only get to once a year.
Yeah, that's very true. You do. I'm feeling rather unfestive as a result, but I'm feeling very happy because this morning we're joined by Zoe Somerville. Good morning, Zoe.
Hello, Zoe.
And my festive red jumper.
Oh yeah, we could. Yeah.
Also, my tree is there.
Oh, wow. Right now, really unseasonal. So this is super exciting. So Zoe, have you had a busy year?
Yes, I mean, it's been a really odd year. It has been really busy because so The Night of the Flood came out last year, originally.
Do you want to show us a picture? Do you want to show us?
Yes, it's right here. This is the hardback, which actually came out in September 2020, pandemic. And then it came out in May 2021 as a paperback. So that was a busy time for me. But then also I've been writing my second novel. So I know, and I had to sort of write that partly. I'd already written quite a bit of it, thank goodness, before the pandemic, but I had to write some of it during lockdown, which was really hard. And then, so that was fun. And then, but I have managed to do that this year. And so that's coming out next year. So yeah, it's been a really bizarre, so yeah, funny year.
Funny year. But we're here really to talk about Night of the Flood.
I know.
Because, well, for me, I don't want to say trigger because that's a negative connotation.
That's bad.
I hear murderous love triangle.
I know.
And I hear floods, and I'm there. So tell us a bit about it first of all, will you?
Yeah, actually, the love triangle came early on.
Yeah.
And actually, it was the play and the place. I had a total instinct that I wanted to write a book set in North Norfolk. It came from somewhere inside me, not in a way, not that complicated. I am from Norfolk, but of course, I'm not actually from North Norfolk, so I don't know, there's some kind of hold from the landscape on me, I guess. And so I had this idea of a group of people whose lives got very complicated and the impact of that. And actually, when I was then doing my research, because I had this idea of the age of the people in the present day, funnily enough, and then looking back to their youth, and their youth was in the 50s. And at that point, I sort of re-found out about the flood. And I'm from Norwich and in Norfolk. I'm not from North Norfolk though, and I'm from Norwich. And I think perhaps because of that, and also because I was born in the 70s, 20 years later, I didn't know a huge amount about the flood. And then I started finding out about it, and I thought, first of all, I can't believe I didn't know more about it. I can't really believe that more people don't know about it. It's amazing how many people don't know. And then I realized, it had to be the setting. It had to be the backdrop, I suppose. It was inherently dramatic. And also people, again, hugely relevant to today as well, although for very different reasons, but it is still something that is happening and is increasingly happening. And I think, and there were floods going on around me when I was writing. Not literally around me, thank goodness, but in the local area, but all around Britain. 2013, there'd been a terrible storm again, another storm surge. So it was in my consciousness, and so that's where it came from. But the characters, funny enough, come first. So that's the initial idea, was the characters.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Because the flood is, well, for me, was a setting. It was something that got in the way of what was already going on in their lives.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because that's why I started. Initially, I was going to write part of the book just on that night. But the thing with that is, I really, while I was writing, I really realised I needed to write before that, because then to understand what had happened to get to that point, because the flood is it's a kind of well, it's the high tide, isn't it? It's the high tide of the story. It's very much a structural relationship to the story as well. So the high tide is like the high point, the crux of the you know, the most dramatic bit, I suppose. But actually, it's been building.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of pressure building. There are relationships going in all kinds of directions, conflicts all over the place. And was it Stephen King and on writing who said, you've got this bad situation, so what can you do to make it worse? And that's exactly what happened. So what's the bad situation? Because it's not just relationships, it's the whole thing about the early 1950s, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there's a lot going on at that time. I became increasingly fascinated. I've always been quite interested in it. Just the idea that you have this extreme situation of a war, a global war, a Second World War, and that affected everybody, and then in so many ways, and changed things for people. And then after that, rationing gets worse. The winter of some of the winters around that time, the 1940s, were appalling, including the 1950s. So the late 1940s was a really, really difficult time. Huge, you know, extreme austerity. Britain was really on its knees, and yet it had also had this tumultuous experience of the Second World War and the new people who had arrived and then carried on arriving. So I thought that is such an interesting mix. And then the other thing that's going on in the early 1950s is Britain's role in the world is changing. So there's the beginning of the atomic war, there's the beginning of the Cold War, which I'm fascinated about. You know, it's still going on in my childhood. So, you know, it feels very close by the Cold War. And so, you know, at the time, the Americans were developing, like, you know, they'd already, you know, used the atom bomb in the Second World War. And then, of course, from there, it developed and it got so much more powerful very, very quickly. And Britain was sort of following behind. And I just found it very interesting at that point, Britain's role in the world, it was on a high from having won the Second World War. And then, of course, but it was a new world after that. It really was. It wasn't really our world anymore, if that makes sense. You know, so I found that really interesting. So that's another reason I found the Americans in Norfolk particularly interesting, because it was about, you know, the clash between those two. And
well, the Jack character completely embodied all the suspicion and drama and not uncertainty, but you just couldn't trust him. And there was an appeal, but you just didn't know what you were dealing with. So he was sort of a whole culture in one person.
Yes, I hope he's not too, I feel a bit bad, but he's not supposed to be, you know, he's supposed to be an attractive character as well as a very suspicious, slightly, you know, what on earth is going on with him. And he's inherently untrustworthy. But yeah, I wanted him to be appealing as well, because actually, let's be honest, you know, American culture at the time was hugely appealing and was having an impact on British culture enormously. Music, you know, technology, you know, a lot of the mod cons that we ended up, you know, that was really dominated in the 1950s, I think, came originally from the States. So I was really interested in the appeal of it as well, and the appeal of something that was quite fresh and new and wasn't, you know, hadn't suffered in the same way that Britain at that time had suffered, and it was, you know, really quite, you know, a really quite bleak place in some ways. And in the early 50s, I think.
You've not used the word triangle at all yet.
I haven't. Yes, I made the love lives very difficult for all of the characters. There's more than one triangle. Someone pointed out to me. It's more of a tangled web, isn't it, than a love triangle. I feel like one of the things that makes life the most conflict is interesting in all novels, isn't it? In all stories. And I gave a lot of conflict, created an awful lot of conflict. Those all just, honestly, this is going to sound really odd, but they came naturally. When the characters, it felt like those were the natural things that they would have wanted, each of them. So, you know, Arthur wants Verity because she is a symbol of something that he would like, which is a kind of respectability and access to worlds that he finds difficult to access. And and also she's his, you know, first love. And that's, you know, she like loves him because he is, you know, a symbol of a childhood that is perhaps was gone, you know, and then, you know, etc., etc. You know, I could carry on. I feel like there's I felt like all of their desires came from who they were to me. So hopefully that comes across. But yeah, unfortunately often thwarted because be boring otherwise.
I came across a really interesting, I can't remember, I didn't write the attribution down now, which is very, very naughty of me, but the idea of floods as something that taking away the mess of life.
Oh, yes, I think, who does
I'm not sure if that was on the dust cover possibly, but I just, as I said earlier, I'm slightly interested with this, how often it appears in various literatures and as a device. So I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I actually wrote a whole essay about this at some point on publication for my publishers, I think. A very interesting concept because it's used, and actually I did quite a lot of reading about floods. There's, I mean, this is going to sound really obvious, but of course it's a biblical concept originally, isn't it? And the idea is that it's a message from God that you've transgressed and you need to start again, and that. It's quite a powerful concept, that, and I think that's originally where it comes from. But then, of course, over the thousands of years, we've all had to deal with them. It's sort of these natural disasters that really are devastating, as you would know. They have taken on over years, especially in literature, but in popular culture as well, an idea of them being something almost deserved. And I'm not saying in any way that that's true, but I think that's sometimes how it's been conceived. So you get, I can't remember, it's Benjamin Britten wrote The Flood, set in Suffolk. There's, I'm trying to think what other floods are there. There's The Mill on the Floss, one of my favourites, and George Eliot. And the flood there is at the end, and cataclysmic, and it provides a kind of very dramatic ending, and also a kind of tragic ending, really. But equally, there's some beauty in it too, and I think it's it's not a very lovely image in many ways, is it, to say that it's something beautiful, but there is something dramatic, and I think sometimes it feels like it can be something that can, like a fire does in a wood, a fire can regenerate. I think the idea is that it must seem, the power of something like a flood or a fire can seem like it's a regenerative thing. It's going to it sweeps away the old and starts again. Now, unfortunately, in real life, what happens is actually all the mess is still there, and it's actually a kind of a taint that's left afterwards. And I sort of play a lot on that idea as well, that actually you want it to sweep things away, but it doesn't. And unfortunately, some things are lost, some things remain. And you don't necessarily have the power to decide. Well, you don't. I mean, this is part of the message, but the idea that there is a fragility to the human beings in the book, because of the power of nature. Ultimately, in the end, they are sort of little people that are really quite fitted around, literally and metaphorically. Yeah. There's another flood I thought about quite. I don't know if you've read Salvage the Bones by Jesmyn Ward. It's their book set at Hurricane Katrina. And that's a really powerful book. I loved that. I can't remember if I read it before or afterwards. So I may have read it afterwards, but it's about the lives. Again, it's the lives in a build up to the flood, and the flood does have some positive implications, funnily enough. So it's an interesting concept. Yeah.
I just find it a really interesting, I don't want to say device, because it's not really a device, but the way it deals with it, as you say, I mean, quite taking a more realistic approach of dealing with detritus, as well as that kind of cleansing, restorative thing, I find just really interesting. And it says quite a lot about the sort of nature of the book in question, about, you know, how an author deals with this sort of cataclysmic event.
Yeah.
So, as I said right at the beginning, I just find it, I'm always drawn by a flood. I don't know.
Yes, me too. I think there's something, well, it's inherently, it feels very precarious. I think actually, especially now, I think we are in a situation where this is so likely to happen. And so it's something that I think is more on our minds perhaps than it would have been then. Actually, funnily enough, in the 50s. I mean, in the 50s, it was actually it was much worse. The particular flood that I write about, the 1953 flood, was much worse because there was no early warning systems, and we hadn't developed a very good sea defences at all. And actually, a lot of things happened because of the flood. The Thames Barrier happened in the 80s because of the flood, because actually they realised, oh my goodness, we could flood London, or if we London could be flooded, and that's really terrible. We can't have that happening. So, you know, 30 years later, it finally opened, the Thames Barrier, but yeah, it was very slow. But yeah, it changed a lot about the sea defences on the Norfolk coast, and all over the world, I think. I mean, not all over the world, but, you know, things like that have a tendency to, so in a way, again, it's an event that pushes things forward. Like, and this is going to sound terrible, but this is also true, events in wartime. Any dramatic event has the impact, usually, has the consequence, usually, it seems to me, to push forward things that need to change. And it's just appalling, isn't it, that those things they don't have to happen, but this is often the way. Something really awful has to happen. And it's the same sometimes with people. Something really awful has to happen for you to realise that you have to change. And so in some ways, I put my characters in those situations too, so that the flood and the aftermath of the flood pushes them into something new. But, you know, in some ways it is a metaphor, I suppose. I don't know if it's a metaphor, but you know, yeah, in a way, I didn't use it as advice. I found out about the flood, and the flood informed everything that happens in the book. But equally, it had to be, otherwise it doesn't, you know, work. It has to be something that changes them, I think. Otherwise, structurally, you know, that's unsatisfying, I think, for a reader.
And I've been sitting here wondering what would have happened if nature hadn't cooperated and given them a flood. Would they have just carried on as they were, sort of?
Really good question. How long would it have taken? I feel like Verity would have gone off with Jack, actually. So who knows? But I don't know. I don't know.
No,
obviously.
Yeah, you have to wonder.
Yeah, you do. That's a really interesting question. Yeah. But that's the thing, isn't it? In life, you know, that's fascinating, isn't it? Thinking about that, characters in a story as well. What would happen if, you know, you could do that with all your favourite characters, can you?
So your next book is called The Marsh House.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's equally sort of muddy. I'm guessing.
I'm afraid to say water features. Well, I'm afraid it's an obsession of mine. Yes, water features very heavily again.
Do you want to tell us anything about that? When does that come out?
Yes, I should have brought my proof. It's out next March, actually, so not too long away. It seems like that's crept up very quickly. I know. That book's, it's actually set along the coast. So The Night of the Flood is very much set in Wells, and I do use a lot of actually Wells next to the sea in the novel. There's a lot of real places. I do twist it a little bit. Some of the names are slightly different. Some are, there's a few things I've made up. But it's all sort of based on real places, if that makes sense. But the Marsh House is set in Stiffkey or Stewkey, depending on how you pronounce it, further along the coast. So Salt Marsh, which of course they have in Wales as well, but yeah, further along a little bit, and they're possibly more, it's more remote, isn't it, around there, which is because the book is partly, it's a mystery book. It has a mystery at its heart, and it's also a ghost story, so it needed to be set somewhere that is more remote and more spooky. And as I find that the coast there quite atmospheric.
Yeah, it's very atmospheric, and I think if you're talking about locations informing the way a story works, and so often people have, you know, authors have a preferred landscape that becomes synonymous with their work. But I mean, oh my gosh, put somebody in Stiff Key and see what happens.
Exactly. You know, you'll have probably, you know, you've heard of M.R. James, and all his books are set, you know, around that bit of the coast, really, or somewhere along there. And to me, it's inherently spooky because the mists and the marsh and the sea and the tides and the sky, and fogs and so on, all come together to create something which is actually really quite dangerous. Dangerous and otherworldly, I think, as well. Not a very human landscape, a landscape that seems something other than human almost. And so, yeah, I have a house at the end of a lane in the Marsh house. That's not a Marsh house.
Just saying, the house at the end of the lane is already giving.
Well, exactly. I know. Yeah, there's a brilliant Neil Gaiman book which is called something like that, isn't that? I can't remember the. Yeah,
that's terrifying.
Yeah, well, it's not like that. That's a great book, but I don't know. There's a little bit of that, I suppose. Yeah. Very much. The M.R. James ghost story kind of was in my mind, definitely. And actually, just writing The Night of the Flood led to it, really, because I was writing about marshes in The Night of the Flood as well, and I thought I really felt strongly that I had to write a ghost story. I'm calling it a ghost story. That's a very specific genre, and I use quite a lot of the tropes and what people's expectations would be of that genre. But actually, it is also it's more of an uncanny story and a haunting story. It's about relationships again, because that's what I'm really interested in.
I'm wondering, in The Night of the Flood, was the deceased mother ghosty? Now I think about it, because there was a lot of talk about the flowing night dress and.
Yes, I was moving towards a little bit of the uncanny in that book too. Actually, I think it's obviously something I quite like. You're right, definitely. So I think the seeds of the Marsh House come a little bit from, and further books that I'm currently writing as well. Actually, I think the mother figure in The Night of the Flood is, I mean, I didn't intend her to be ghostly actually, but I think she haunts Verity, you know, in a way that, you know, I'm not saying she sees her in a ghost like
the memory
exactly.
definitely haunts her, and the worry. Yeah,
exactly. And haunts in the way that, you know, somebody who is no longer around haunts the present, by you're second guessing what would they think, and then, you know, she hears her voice a couple of times and things like that. And as I think that would be entirely natural for a young woman who's lost her mother in such, you know, also strange circumstances, unclear circumstances. And so yes, it definitely did have an impact on the next book. Yeah, definitely. That whole.
I can't wait, Zoe.
Oh, good. Yes, I'm
plough through my to-read list, so I've got some quality time to sit down with. Very exciting. But
yeah,
on the off chance that, well, not on the off chance, let's say people have read The Night of the Flood. They can't quite wait till March. They need to be reading something. Tell us what you've been reading at the moment.
Oh, what I've been reading, yeah.
Tell us what people should read next.
Yeah, I've got loads of ideas. I've been thinking about this because Tracy said, be thinking about books that people who've read this might like. So and I can tell you what I've been reading as well. So I'll start with what I've been reading. I read this recently. It was on the booker list, and I got it for my birthday, which is in November. And like Perpetual by Francis Spufford, and it's a beautiful book. It's about, basically it's about lives, a whole series of lives, sort of group of people, which again, a bit like, you know, the Night of Floods, a group of people, but this one takes them from 1944 to I can't remember, to more or less the present day, 2009 or something like that. So it's a really sweeping book that takes you through, rather than mine is really focused, but this is sweeping.
This one is very much about what if, though, isn't it?
Exactly. And this part, what I was going to say is, you asked me earlier, what would have happened if the flood hadn't happened? Well, this is what this asks, again, essentially, isn't it? So Francis Spufford actually based it on a real life, a bit like I did, I suppose, but he totally switches it. So I suppose I would have, you know, it's very different, very different. He bases it on the real life bomb attack, or V2 bomb, I think it was, German bomb on a Woolworths in South London that did kill lots and lots of people, including children. And he says, well, what if some of those children survived? And then he takes them through. And at first you think, yeah, but they didn't. But that's the beauty of it, isn't it? It's sort of about fiction, and it's what's really lovely about it, I think, is that all the characters are so flawed. I love that. I mean, I love that about any books. For me, characters have to be hugely flawed to be interesting, and they're all really flawed. And we see, but it's very beautifully done, and he's incredibly good. He's incredibly good at plays. Funny, his play, he's not very glamorous, but it's sort of South London. So I used to live in South London actually years ago, and I used to teach in South London. I was an English teacher, and it's got bits of teaching, it's got bits of schools, so it's got lots. Very me.
It's got a really graphic panic attack, hasn't it?
Yes, it's a beauty. That's amazingly written on a London bus. Yeah.
It was really disturbing. I had to put it down for a week after that.
Really, that's interesting. Yeah,
but it is beautifully written, and it stays with me, those characters. What I found really interesting is that Robert Harris's book V2 came out at almost the same time, and it opens with exactly the same incident.
Does it?
Yes.
I've heard of that, but I saw that book, but I didn't know that.
Yeah, but then he goes on, and the point of the next 300 pages is how flawed the V2 rockets were, and how so many of them failed to meet any target at all. But that one did hit the Woolworths in real life and killed all those children.
Oh, yeah. Oh, how interesting. Gosh, I sort of feel like you should read those as a companion piece or something.
Well, yes, I read them in the same sort of month, which was really a strange experience.
And actually probably quite disturbing. But actually it takes a gift, doesn't it, to be able to, he takes you into lots of different characters' minds, and in lots of different characters in different times, and it's done very, very well, I thought. And
it's beautiful.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of recent historical fiction. I don't know what, there is no great phrase for it, but ultimately I love books that are set in the 20th century. Ultimately is my favorite. So another book that I loved, and I read while I was writing, I think I read it, I can never remember when I read books, you know, I don't keep a diary. Manhattan Beach, I think I've got, is that behind me somewhere? Probably. Jennifer Egan's Manhattan Beach is an amazing read if you haven't read that. So that's set in the Second World War actually, and it's very hard to find a good angle on the Second World War that hasn't been done already, that she manages to make it about the female divers, or divers generally, but who worked in Manhattan beaches in Manhattan and during the Second World War, and it's pitch perfect. It's an amazing bit of historical fiction. It's incredible. I've
heard very good things about it. We have it in the shop, but I haven't got to that one yet.
Well, it's a couple of years ago now, so it's out in paperback, so that's good, but it's one of those rare books that I bought in hardbacks. It's so good. What I've also been reading recently, and this is more books of the time rather than books written now, historical fiction as in writing now about this book is Persephone, an amazing publisher who published sort of women particularly, whose books have been sort of fallen out of fashion or who out of publication actually. And so this one I've just read, Good Evening, this is very war based, isn't it? It's because I've got a bit of the Second World War in my third book. So Good Evening, Mrs. Craven, the wartime stories of Mollie Panter-Downes. And Mollie Panter-Downes, and you know, they have these beautiful
Oh, wow.
Beautiful end papers and lovely bookmarks. And this is short stories, and I do try to read some short stories as well. And this book is it's little glimpses into life during the Second World War, and it's just really brilliant on class and you know, that sort of thing, and the way that people really did speak and things like that, which I think, you know, as somebody who tries to write you know, with some sense of authenticity, you have to read things that are written at the time as well. So yeah, brilliant, really good. What else? I did have some other ideas. I actually wrote them down, so just a sec, I'm going to have a quick look. What else did I? Oh yes, the other things that I thought, that's not it. I can't find it now. Oh, I know. This is Second World War again. I'm coming back to it again. All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. That's another really classic historical fiction, but written with real sort of authenticity, I suppose, and beautiful characterization. Two people from different sides of the divide, so German and French in this case, and they come together. And actually that I really like books which have, usually anyway, I like reading books, and I often write them, who have a few different narrators or a few different points of view, something that interests me. So Francis Spufford's book has lots, and what was I going to say? Yes, and Manhattan Beach has more than one as well. And yeah, the Anthony Doerr book has 3 actually, and one is shorter, and they are completely separate points of view, and they come together, and it's got a really great sense of tension, that book as well, actually. So that's a bit of a masterclass in how to build tension for writers as well. So it's a sort of a writery sort of book, I think, that one as well. Yeah. But yeah, other books that people might like would be Maggie O'Farrell's books that are brilliantly done. And she hasn't written any that much. So, oh, I know which one is good for the 50s would be The Hand That First Held Mine. That's a good one if you're interested in the 1950s. That's set in the 1950s in Soho. That's a good book. And then other 1950s based books, Small Pleasures. I'm sure everyone's read that by now. Obviously that hadn't come up when I wrote mine, but that's a brilliant 1950s based book. So
is that the Clare
the Clare Chambers book,
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that was a bestseller, I think. And well, as far as I know, that's a beautifully written book set in the 1950s. And a friend of mine, Louise Hare, wrote a book set in the 1950s called This Lovely City. I don't know if you've read that.
I know the book,
really
but I've not read it.
Yeah, that's really good as well. That's set, and again, that's a really interesting little bit of history that I don't think. Well, actually, Andrea Levy did a really good job on that, didn't she, in Small Island? But This Lovely City picks it up afterwards. It's the Windrush generation coming into London. Again, South London, another link, in sort of Clapham area in late 40s, and then just 1950, I think. And that's so that's a really good fit actually in some ways, because it's a mystery as well. Somebody gets accused of something. So it's about Black immigrants or Caribbean immigrants coming to London in the late 1940s and early 50s, and that's a brilliant book as well, and really quite tense, and it's written in a way that's you're sort of wanting to find out what happens. Yeah, that's
good. I'm glad to hear that about This Lovely City, because it had an attractive cover, and the publisher said that it was brilliant, but I hadn't spoken to anyone else who'd read it. But
yeah, I know. I think it's probably, you know, it's one of those, maybe again because the setting is it's very, well, I suppose, I don't know really, the setting's very South London, but it's so maybe, you know, it would have definitely appealed to lots of people in London, but actually it's pretty, I suppose, it's that time, isn't it, when the late 1940s, early 50s were a time of real change because of, you know, the post-war sort of time. And actually, I've done loads of research since writing The Night of the Flood. And there were so many other people who had come into Norfolk around that time. So I've since discovered that during the war, there's lots of POWs, of course, some of them who stayed, and there was a whole different community of people, and some of them did stay, and so changed Norfolk, I'm sure, and lots of Americans, of course, the bases. As probably we know that bit a bit more, if we're, you know, but actually it wasn't just Americans, there was loads of other people as well. So yeah.
Right.
What a reading list.
I know. I always have too many books to read, always.
I think that's a problem, is it? Too many books. I think the issue is always too little time. But
yeah, that's exactly it.
Books, I don't think is.
No, I have to say, especially since becoming a writer, I never think, oh, I don't have enough to read. The opposite. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us for coffee, Zoe. It's been really lovely to chat with you, and I hope that if you're passing through our neck of the woods, you can stop in and say hello in person, in real life.
Yeah, I hope to come up for the next book.
Yeah, it would be great to see you.
That would be brilliant.
Okay, well, thank you ever so much, Zoe.
No worries.
Bye.
Bye.